Welcome to Navigating Receiverships, a podcast from the Commercial Receivers Association focused on building a better understanding of what brings companies into receivership, what happens in receivership, what makes them unique, some alternatives to receiverships, and ultimately, what happens to the business as the receivership is closed out. I'm one of your hosts, Eric Morcheski, CRA board member and CEO of Nimble Strategies. I'm here today with Stacey Hampton, founder and principal consultant for Asset NOI Consulting. Stacey, thanks so much for joining us. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about you and your background?
Yeah, so I am based out of San Antonio, Texas, but I work with multifamily properties nationwide. I am the principal consultant for Asset NOI, which is a multifamily consulting firm, and we specialize in stepping in short-term, high-impact projects with the existing teams that are at the property most of the time. And we are turning the properties around and getting them stabilized, often for their next capital event or getting ready to put them on the market.
So, obviously, we don't at birth know how to turn around a distressed property. Like, how did you gain this experience and be able to do such unique work?
Yeah, so I was in multifamily, like I said, for it's actually over 25 years, but after the GFC, I was working for a third-party property management company, and my clients were picking up these distressed deals. Many of them had 25-30% of their property was vacant and had units that had been down for a couple of years. And so I would jump in and when we take these properties over and build a strategy and get them stabilized. And at that point in time, a lot of times the debt was structured to where you had to meet certain operational milestones to access the capital. So for me, I was always trying to stay ahead of that because one of the beliefs I have is that when you're deploying capital and repositioning an asset, it's absolutely critical to do it quickly, right? The worst thing you can do is spend 2 years repositioning an asset. And so I would always try to be well ahead of those operational milestones so we could access the capital and get through the project. So that's kind of where I started. And then value add really became prevalent in our industry of repositioning these 80s assets with all these renovations and exterior lifts. And so I got a lot of experience there. In many cases, I would find that we would be picking up properties where we might end up turning over 60, sometimes even 70% of the existing tenant base during those repositions. So that's what led me there. And then, back in 2023, I started my own firm and started working for lenders, owners, asset managers, and most recently a receivership in repositioning these properties and turning them around.
That's
So
great. Yeah. So tell
it's
us a
kind
little bit, set the stage a little bit for the case we're about to talk about here, and the property we're about to talk about here. Obviously, it's multifamily housing. Give us a little bit of background about, location, what was going on in the market, what was going on with the property prior to you coming in.
Yeah, so the property that I thought would be really relevant to the current challenges we're having today is a property that it was in Houston as a 90s garden style, and basically the borrower had just ran out of capital. And so I was contacted by the lender on the deal actually prior to foreclosure to help them, source a property management company and build the turnaround plan and kind of get a better scope of what it was going to take to stabilize the property. So, when we got there, it was 78%. It was nearly 300 units, so 78% occupied. And we ended up finding out that it was really more like 71% occupied because there were, you know, 20 some odd units that were showing occupied in the system that we were discovering that they were actually vacant. So when the new property management company and I took over the property, they wanted to retain, the people that were there so we didn't lose that knowledge. But the prior owner was kind of a boutique size property management company. So they didn't have a lot of infrastructure. The manager didn't have a lot of support. And the new company comes in and they're bringing, all these great marketing resources and really just diving in. So at some point we had to approach the manager that had been there previously and say, what's going on with these 20 it was 21, 23 units that are showing occupied in the system, but they're clearly vacant. And her answer was they were instructed to do what they called a one in, one out. So he's smiling. I'm sure probably a lot of your audience has heard of this, where basically you don't move anybody out until you move someone in. And so essentially the property management company didn't want to set off any additional alarms by seeing the vacancy drop. So 71% occupancy. The property had clearly been distressed for a while. They'd been, you know, didn't have the money to repair things as what's typical in these sort of situations. We had a lot of units to turn. But what was really interesting for me about that property was how and why it got there. The good thing about being brought on by the lender before they took the property back is that we were able to request a lot of information that you might not otherwise get because the management companies in those scenarios aren't always the most cooperative. So I was able to access, 12 months worth of real operational data about who had moved in, who'd moved out, when, those type of things. And the thing that really stood out to me right away was the turnover for that property, the 12 months prior, 62% turnover in a 12-month period. And then as I started to dig deeper, 40, almost 50% of that turnover was skips and evictions. So, of course, it's like a thread, right? You get a hold of the thread and you just keep pulling. And basically what I figured out was that the submarket in and of itself was around 90, 91%. And this property's in the 70s. It was because the prior owner had positioned it as kind of a second chance leasing sort of situation where they had lowered their screening criterias and they had done that as a strategy to push rents higher than what was in the submarket. So if you're offering a second chance leasing to, what would otherwise be a demographic that has a hard time getting an apartment, they're more likely to pay higher rents. But the
Right.
trade-off is they're very financially unstable. So this property was having about seven skips or evictions per month, which was just
Feels
completely
like
unsustainable.
feels like a lot of work.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So that was really interesting. And frankly, if they'd had a change in strategy and instead of looking at and focusing so hard on the rents or the price per square foot, and instead pivoted to, you know, focusing more on revenue through occupancy, they would have never found themselves in that situation.
So maybe this is a good space to get into this a little bit, but you touched on like a lot of what you're doing is basically a turnaround plan for these properties. And to those of us that aren't regularly doing multifamily housing, most of us go, the plan is to rent more spaces out, right? At a higher price. That's
Right.
the oversimplified version, but like what are some of the things that you're looking at that and you don't have to get into specifics. Everyone has their own recipe, and that's what makes you valuable. But at the same time, what are some of those things that you're looking at going, and maybe you touched a little bit on it, a marketing plan and a marketing budget, but what are some of those things that you're analyzing for the lender or for those groups bringing you in?
Yeah, so you know, the first thing that I'm really looking for is causation,
Hmm.
right? Because that's what I'm brought in to do. I need to understand what went wrong before I start planning what's going to be right about this deal.
Hmm.
Understanding how that property operates. I think a lot of buyers and borrowers look at multifamily real estate more as an investment, but don't necessarily look at it as a business. You know,
Hmm.
in order for it to be a good investment, you've got to operate it
Hmm.
to be a good investment. So I'm looking for what's went wrong, what are the challenges, and though they're very similar, there are specificities. Some properties are more challenged because they're in a market with a high risk demographic. Some are off the road and just don't have great visibility. And so I'm building an operational plan to overcome those challenges. If you're in a high risk market where you're having a lot of defaults, like Atlanta, where there's an enormous amount of fraud, then we're prioritizing. And I'll present this to my client, the data. Here's what's been happening. How are we going to operate differently to mitigate these challenges? And so, if you're, for instance, and much like this property, if you've got a higher risk demographic, maybe because of financial circumstances, especially if you're in workforce housing or you're having, in a market where fraud's pretty rampant, then, your residents who are actually paying, you're incentivized to retain them.
Hmm.
And so, of course, everybody wants retention. That's a really easy thing to say, but to niche down and say, we want to offer incentives to our residents who have a good payment history, and we also want to offer them longer lease terms. So we have fewer expirations in a year. Believe it or not, there's still tons of people that just operate on a 12-month lease and that's it, right? And particularly those who came into the industry during value add, where it was like, oh man, I don't want to do anything longer than 12 months because I might have a chance to increase rents.
Hmm.
What if rents go up? You know, it really depends on the market. Sometimes that's not the right strategy. The property that I was telling you about, it was costing them $1,800 to turn a unit for the make ready, so to get it ready for the next resident. And then it was, about 45 days before the next renter would come in. So whatever rent gains you're going to be getting are going to be lost in turnover. So if we can extend the leases out where it makes sense, those are the kind of strategies that I'm looking for my clients.
It's really interesting. So jumping back to Houston in this particular case, what actions did you take during this process to obviously take it from the 71% that you mentioned to build it into a stronger asset so that the lender or the people who brought you in felt it was in a better situation than when you got there?
Yeah, yeah. So the task that was given to me is we want to put this on the market in 6 months. So
Mhm.
we need to get it stabilized. So, you know, uh, just like most cases, I mean, we cleaned up the property, freshened it up, but the big lever was trying to, now we know we've got a high risk demographic that with this property's been serving. So we've got to turn that reputation around. We got to make sure that we are mitigating those risks. Because here's the thing, you can't, and of course we didn't know at the time, is this just the demographic for this market? Or are we going to be able to source a new demographic? In most cases, you can't just go, a community, apartment community, it serves the community it serves. You're not going to
Mhm.
go be able
Yeah.
to pull in any substantial way, a higher echelon of demographic that's, not going to have those challenges. So, we made sure that we were really stringent in our process in qualifying applicants, checking for fraud. And so that's the first things first, right? We don't want to rent to people and be in the same place again. This property had been on a roller coaster. It was at 78 when we got there, but there were months in the prior 2 years, I had access to those financials where it's like every year it hit 90, barely get there, and then systematically you could see it drop back down again and be back in the 80s and then ultimately 70s because they'd fill it up and by offering these great incentives and all
Mhm.
that, and then of course those people would default and skip or move out. So we tightened up the screening. Obviously, we needed to turn the units. So we had a 6 week plan to get, all the units ready except for the hardest turns. And we tracked that very closely. Probably one of the most important things that we did when we took over was the property management team and I brought in a lot of people to not only just get work orders done and reestablish our residents with our reputation with our paying residents, but we started, just cleaning up and improving the place. We had the whole community pressure washed by the third week. We had all the light bulbs, those little details that
Mhm.
I think a lot of times the owners or the borrowers just they don't think they need to get in the weeds. As a matter of fact, there's lots of business coaches out there that tell you you just need to hire right and don't get into the weeds. And I'm like, well, yeah, if things are going great, sure, you don't want to get in the way, but when things are going wrong, the weeds, you need to be working the soil,
Mhm.
you know?
Yeah.
So a lot of those things. But then, so as we tighten the applicant screening and the fraud mitigation, the next problem we had was, okay, so now we're saying, as we were only declining 10% of the applicants previously, now we're declining 40%
Mhm.
of the applicants. So what do we got to do? We got to go find more people. We've got to go get the prospects. And so we, relaunched a campaign to basically reestablish the property in tandem with a true marketing plan that was we started out really big. Sometimes people start out with smaller budget and they want to grow as needed.
Mhm.
We went the other way. Let's
Yeah.
start out with a big budget once we have our units ready and flood the property with interest and dominate the submarket, and then tailor down as our occupancy went up. So,
Mhm. And that appears to have worked, right? What was the ultimate outcome of all these efforts?
so this was in September when we took it over. It was 78, but really 71. By March, the property was at 92. The delinquency by April was under 5%. It'd been running, somewhere between 15 to 20% at month end. And so they were able to put the property on the market and it closed in June. So it was a really successful project and I've checked in on it through market surveys
Yeah.
a couple of times since it closed and it's still sitting around 92, 93. So it
Well,
looks like
that's
things are
good.
still going well. Yeah.
Yeah, so someone is very glad that they engaged you, right, to do this process. Obviously, you came into this with a lot of experience from some of what you had done in the past. But what were some of the lessons learned or things that you feel like people should really keep in mind as they tackle a multifamily housing project like this?
I think you really need to understand how the property in the submarket operates. I feel like looking in depth at the property, a lot of what we do is forensic analysis. We're
Mhm.
really digging in and looking at things like when do the leases expire? Are there peaks that are going to destabilize the property? For instance, if you have 200 unit property and you have 30 lease expirations in a single month, you get to know that ahead of time by looking at the rent roll. Go ahead and address that now. Making sure that the property is priced competitively in the submarket. There's only one thing worse than renting an apartment below the market, which is not renting it at all.
Yeah.
So, um, I would say that, and listen, if you're taking over a property or buying a property, be ready to reposition operationally on day one. You don't have to wait and work on it over this next 6 months. Like you have the most momentum at the moment you close. You have all that knowledge and energy, and you've got all those teams with you right then. 6 months from now, excitement's going to wane, and it's just going to be another property in your portfolio. So strike while the iron's hot.
Yeah, I like it. Well, thank you so much for doing this today, Stacey. Is there anything you want to leave listeners with?
Yeah, I think I would say for anyone who's working in multifamily, whether it's on the receivership side or operations, having a team to work with and utilizing the resources that you have, you're never really alone. You've always got people you can lean on, even in the scenarios where, we had talked about earlier, where sometimes it's really difficult to get, when you have a distressed asset, to get people to come out to the property and help you. But I found that if I call somebody and say, "Hey, I can't get anybody out to this property. You know somebody?" The relationships that you have and being able to leverage them is just everything. So if you think you're alone, you're not. The great thing about this industry is there's always someone out there willing to help.
Great point. Yeah, it's not unique to one area or anything, right? There's multifamily housing across the country and around the world. May
Yeah,
look a little different depending on where you are in the country or where you are in the world, but it is some fundamentals of it probably operate very similarly. So thank you so much for
absolutely.
doing this. Really appreciate it. We will look forward to seeing you further and hearing from you further at future Commercial Receivers Association events.
I'm looking forward to it as well. Thank you, Eric, so much for having me on. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for joining Navigating Receiverships, brought to you by the Commercial Receivers Association. Find more information at commercialreceiver.org and catch every Navigating Receiverships podcast by subscribing through your favorite platform today.